Alright, welcome back. This is now our fifth, and it's actually going to be our final lecture on ancient Greece. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking mostly about philosophy. Before we get into philosophy, however, I just want to talk a little bit about the ancient Greek approach to knowledge in general. If you were a lower class or a slave, then typically your tasks were the only thing that you were formally educated in doing. However, if you were upper class, let's say middle class, to where you had some expendable income, or especially the aristocracy and the royalty, this would be your approach to education. Typically, a family would have a slave of particular status that would be called the pedagogue, and the pedagogue had the task of taking either one child or multiple children around the polis from house to house to different tutors. So you see in this relief up here on the top left a Greek school teacher, a pupil, and a pedagogue. So this is definitely not the way that we're used to thinking of schooling today, where you have a school environment with, let's say, 25 kids to a classroom and several different grades that are all, we have maybe 1,000 children that are all localized in one place, and it's paid for it by the taxpayers, and everybody has equal access to it. No, this is something that was far different. So if you were a pedagogue, then your job was to take your master's child from house to house. Maybe you have a tutor that is particularly skilled in geometry or in music or in combat, and you would take them from place to place, from house to house, so that they could get their education. Maybe you would go to one house at different days of the week, or maybe you would go to multiple houses. That could differ depending on the specific desire of your master. Nevertheless, this was the approach. And when it came to educating the individual, you had the idea of educating not only their mind, but their body and their mind and their spirit. So when you think of educating the body, you can think of just general fitness, but also skills, specifically combat skills. Archery is also something that was practiced. I talked about how in Hellenic Greek, the pre-Alexandrian period of time in Greece, archery was not really thought of as a skill that it would be noble to use in combat. However, it was still very useful if you think of hunting, even just being able to focus your mind. Archery, I love both doing archery and then also just watching specifically young people do archery, because you'll have kids whose attention span is all over the place, but if you give them a bow and arrow and a target, then they know how to shut up. They know how to focus on the task at hand, and it's something that they can teach them to filter out the noise of the world. So you would educate them in their physicality, their mind, which you could think of the word science. Science just means knowledge, although that is a Latin word, but still it would be knowledge of the world around you, knowledge of your own physical being, knowledge of the physical world. And so you'd have anatomy. You would also have these theories of anatomy that I think are really interesting, because they are largely not really held to anymore. But for example, one theory that I find interesting is the idea that the body had different types of fluids, different humors inside. You had yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. And these are still the words that we use to talk about four, broadly speaking, personality types of choleric, melancholic, sanguine, and phlegmatic. So a person who is choleric is said to be very extroverted, aggressive, decisive, ambitious, quick-tempered, cunning. Melancholic would be someone who's introverted. They're very idealistic, introspective, often prone to depression, which is why you say melancholy and depressed are virtually synonyms. You have a sanguine personality type, which would be someone who's extroverted, but not necessarily as ambitious, more like fun-loving, carefree, optimistic, kind, caring, and loving. And then phlegmatic, these would be people who are maybe more introverted, but again, not so much introspective or like philosophical, prone to that philosophical malaise, but rather someone who's just lazy, slow, cowardly, patient, docile, low achievers, maybe we would call them. These are, I think it's fascinating to just compare these to, the Ninja Turtles or the Harry Potter houses, and you'll notice that in a lot of even pop culture, whenever you see a friend group, or whenever you see personality types that are divided into four, they tend to follow these, and I think it's interesting to just look for different modern cultural examples of this. Another thing when it came to the sciences, or, knowledge of the world around you, big deal for them would have been geometry. It was said that on the door to Plato's schoolhouse or his, academy where he would teach people, it said, "Don't even bother coming in here unless you understand geometry." Geometry was thought to have been kind of a window into the divine will, the will of the gods, the mind of the gods, because you had all of these shapes, you had math, you had these things that seemed to be true and discovered by humans rather than things like the bow and arrow or things like the chariot that were invented by humans. These are principles that govern the universe. Even today we call the five regular solids, we call them the Platonic solids, these different shapes and both the personality types and even the shapes, they're supposed to correspond to different elements. So this is where a lot of that concept, at least in the West, tends to take shape. So that would be your body, your mind, and then also, you would want to nourish your spirit in your education. So studying art, studying music, studying literature, the classics, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey. This would be a way that the pedagogue would take their master's child, the student, to a teacher's house who would teach them how to sing, teach them how to memorize the epic poems of the Greeks. And it was supposed to do something more than just giving you knowledge, but giving you a way to understand beauty, aesthetics, and especially the ideals of heroism that were supposed to be portrayed in the stories of the gods and the stories of the heroes. So that's kind of the general approach to knowledge. But another thing, and I would say this is maybe chief among the sciences when it comes to, the studies of these people, and definitely what they're most known for. What they're most well known for is not necessarily their geometric accomplishments, even though you can think of the Pythagorean theorem, Pythagoras, or Euclidean geometry. What they're most well known for is not even necessarily their literature. A lot of people do think of their styles of combat, but what they're most well known for as far as a school of thought would be philosophy. Philosophia just means a love of wisdom. Philos means a fondness for something. Sophia means wisdom. And we've talked before about the agora, the marketplace, which would be usually centered in the middle of located in the middle of a polis. And because it was a place that was frequented by everyone, this is where you bought and sold goods. This was your market. This was a place where a lot of statecraft happened. This is where the assemblies would usually gather for big democratic assemblies and decisions to be made. But this is also a place where different philosophers could come and kind of preach in the street corner about what their philosophy is of how to live a fulfilled life. And philosophy is supposed to touch on everything. It's supposed to touch on your relationship to the gods, your relationship to beauty, how a government should be run, how you should conduct your marriage, your relationship to alcohol, just a general understanding of even things like math and physics and the world around you. Philosophy is supposed to inform the way that you look at everything. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about three Hellenic philosophers. So that's before Alexander the Great is Hellenic, remember? And then we'll talk about two Hellenistic philosophies and their main progenitors. So starting off, one of the most I'm just going to talk about the three most well-known, which are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates is an interesting guy because we don't really know firsthand his philosophy. Everything that we know about him comes to us from the pen and the tongue of Plato, his most accomplished student. So Socrates trained Plato, and even though he didn't write anything down about his philosophy, we can trust that Plato has probably given him a fair shake in representing the way that he actually taught and thought. Controversial take that Socrates had is he believed that the gods were all fake. He would watch people going to the temples and making sacrifices, sacrificing valuable oxen or giving payments to the temple priests for the beautification of the temple. And he would go, look, it doesn't feel like these prayers and these sacrifices are really consequential. It doesn't look like it's really affecting the outcome of a battle. You would make a sacrifice to Ares, hoping to win a battle in a war, and then you would lose the battle, and the priest would explain something about how, actually the sacrifice wasn't done properly, or maybe you didn't do all of the right steps in the ritual that was supposed to be accomplished. And Socrates thought of this as kind of a racket, just a way for people to make money and and get by. Even though, interestingly enough, to the credit of ancient Greece, they didn't really have a priest class. It's not like there was a group of people that were just consistently priests, and their children would be priests, and their children after them would be priests. The office of priest was thought of more as a civic duty, but still Socrates thought of this as a major drain on society. And then the other thing is he was very anti-democracy. And remember, to them, democracy wasn't, every man, woman, child, slave, free, whoever can decide. It was really only the citizens, in most polises, only the male citizens, which would be, a little bit more upper class, that were able to have the access to the levers of power, of the decision-making process of how a government is supposed to be run. And even that, Socrates thought that was too many people, too many cooks in the kitchen, too many people that were trying to affect the outcome. And he said the problem is that so many people are not wise. They're not philosophers. They don't really understand what it would take to make a society work. And so they're just going to vote for the people and vote for the things that give them the greatest advantage. He would say, imagine that you have a candy shop owner and a doctor, and they're both trying to plead with you and tell you, what's actually best for your health. And the candy shop owner, is making his case. The doctor makes his case, and most people are just like a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, who's just going to go with what feels better in the moment. And because of all these takes, because he was called an atheist, and because he was anti-democratic, the city of Athens, where he conducted his philosophy, was heavy set against him, and they told him, look, you must leave. You're not allowed to practice your philosophy here anymore. You're corrupting the youth. You have all these students who are going after you. And Socrates, was given the option of, you're either exiled from the city or we're going to kill you. And he took some time. He looked within and looked for the answer, and eventually he said, okay, I'm not going to leave. You're going to have to come to my house and kill me. And so famously we have this painting in the bottom from many centuries later, but he is given a cup of hemlock poison that he's supposed to drink, and he just takes the cup and drinks it willingly and dies not long after. And this move is thought of as being a tragedy, but it also gives him a lot of weight. The idea that he was willing to die rather than shut up. The idea that he was willing to die rather than just go along to get along and say, actually, I believe what all of the people in charge say that I'm supposed to believe. So Socrates' legacy is probably magnified immensely because of that step. His most notable student, Plato, went on to become possibly an even more famous philosopher. So Plato's big idea, his main contribution, I would say, is this idea of the world of forms, or you have the allegory of the cave. And so Plato would say that humans are like this guy who's been trapped in a cave for his entire life, and he's never seen the outside world. And there are these people who come along behind him, and they cast shadows of real things, like a real bird or a real apple or a real whatever. They kind of project those things onto the wall. And so you, as the individual who's been trapped in the cave, you look at these shadows, you look at these limited representations of the real thing, and you think that that's all that there are. But in reality, there are these much more fleshed out forms, ideal, real forms that you're not able to see. And only by studying these shadows are you able to come to an understanding of what the real thing is. And, his ultimate goal, he would say, is to escape the cave. And so philosophy was big on, Plato, his philosophy was big on the study of aesthetics. You should think on beauty. You should focus on beauty. First of all, you should just have your brain turned on, but you should focus on beauty. When you picture an apple, if you were to just picture an apple in your mind, you're probably not picturing a diseased or a worm-eaten or, even just an abnormal apple. You're probably picturing an idealized version of an apple. That apple doesn't exist, and every apple is considered good or bad based on how well it measures up to that ideal of what an apple should be. A great example of this is in geometry. You have let's say, an equilateral triangle, right? An equilateral triangle has perfectly straight edges, and every angle meets at exactly 60 degrees, and there are no real triangles in the world. There are no actual real equilateral triangles. If you were to zoom in at the microscopic level or the atomic level, there are irregularities in the straightness of the lines and the angles. So it's an ideal, but that doesn't mean that it's not useful. Just because it's nowhere existing in the real world doesn't mean that it's not useful to think on it and to use that ideal to map out, your house or whatever. Let's say there's an ideal right angle, 90-degree angle. That's the angle that you should be using to try to get your house to adhere to. So when you look at a beautiful building or a beautiful rose or a beautiful woman, those things are supposed to help you understand, okay, why are these things beautiful? Why do they appeal to me? Well, probably it's because they're healthy. Probably it's because they function well in the thing that they're supposed to do. A beautiful rose is going to be effective at attracting pollinators. The more beautiful a building is probably more structurally sound. The more beautiful a person is, it tends to be a marker of health and being close to the genetic ideal. And so something we don't have an example of in the real world is an ideal society. And so Plato wrote a lot of things. He wrote about, he wrote the Symposium. He wrote a lot of different books, but one thing that he's most well known for is this idea of the Republic. And the Republic is a treatise, a book that he wrote trying to describe what an ideal society would look like. And he was basically saying that, look, just like you have Sparta, and Sparta's ideal that they strive for, and they're pretty stinking good at it, is making warriors, making hoplites. And because they have their entire society focused on that, they do a really good job in war. But he would say that for Athens, and really just in general, what a polis should strive for is for good citizens, for citizens that are healthy, that are functioning, that are helpful to each other. They're altruistic, right? So they represent different virtues. And so Plato writes this book, The Republic, and it's about having, philosopher kings or philosophers who are, they understand the issues, not like what Socrates hated in democracy, just every person weighing in on, well, I think it should be like this. But Plato's Republic was more of an explanation of like, okay, if things were run by people who understood, and those people were elected by people who understood how society needs to function, we would be a lot closer to the ideal. And then Plato famously had a student whose name was Aristotle. Aristotle, probably even more famous, or a lot of times he's just called the philosopher. He is, I would say, definitely the most influential of the ancient Greek philosophers. And so Aristotle's philosophy centered around this idea of understanding the order of the universe. So there's a lot of geometry in there. There's a lot of really just trying to understand nature, plants, animals, dissecting things, seeing how things work, and to be able to ascertain the design and the function of the universe, that basically the math that the gods used when they constructed the universe. This is what he called the logos. We can think of logic that comes from this. So a logic table would be an understanding of, okay, what things can be considered true or false based on previous statements. And a logic, if you understand the logic behind a car, you understand how it works, and you understand how you should treat that car to keep it functioning as well as possible for as long as possible. And so he applied this to a lot of things, but one field that he applied this to is the idea of ethics. Ethics is this idea of how we ought to behave ourselves. And so Aristotle listed out these 11 ideals, these 11 virtues that people should live by. And he said that typically every virtue lies in the middle of two vices, where you have too little of that virtue or you have too much of it, which is like, you'd say, well, how can you have too much of a good thing? Well, maybe virtue is, if you think of having too much virtue, that's technically impossible. But what he's talking about is taking an idea too far, where it's not really practical anymore. So, for example, you should be brave. If you lack bravery, we call you a coward. But if you are overly brave, or if you apply bravery all the time in lack of, even in lack of context and wisdom, then we might call you rash or reckless. A person should be generous. If they're not generous at all, we call them stingy. But if they're just kind of giving out things all the time, it's like, okay, this person's a little extravagant. Maybe they're trying to, make up for a lack of personality and just give gifts to people so they continue to hang around them, right? You should be witty. You should be someone who's, is able to say something true in an interesting way, in a way that's actually going to get through to people. If you lack that virtue, then you're just a bore. You're just boring to be around. But if you're always trying to be witty, you turn into a buffoon. You turn into a jester. Another one that I think is interesting to kind of put your set your mind to is this idea of being industrious, right? So you think of being industrious as being, you're concentrated on the task, you're conscientious. If you lack that, then we call you lazy. But there are some people, they focus too much on one individual thing. We can call that being single-minded. Single-mindedness might not always be a bad thing. In fact, people who are single-minded typically wind up in history books because they're dead set on accomplishing something. But that's 1% of the people who, exercise their life in that way. Most of the time we say that this person is monomaniacal. They only have their mind set on one thing, and therefore, their relationships fall apart. Their life is lacking in all of these different areas because they're only focused on that one, let's say that it's a sport or an academic pursuit, or for a guy to be single-mindedly focused on one girlfriend that he's trying to get over to the exclusion of paying due attention to the rest of the world around him. I'm not going to talk about Alexander the Great, but he is definitely the most notable of the pupils of Aristotle. Aristotle was born in Macedonia, and he worked for King Philip II as the tutor, the philosophy tutor for his son, philosophy teacher for his son Alexander, before eventually he went on to Athens and continued to philosophize and to write. So Alexander the Great, like I said, he changes everything. The world before him, the Greek world before him, feels purely Greek. It feels like it's not really mixed in with a lot of other things, but because of Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire, you start to have Egyptian influence and Jewish influence and Persian influence and even Indian or Hindu influence that starts to, all of these things and Greek influence start to bleed together, so that Greek thought starts to affect all these other things, and all of these other forms of thought start to affect Greek philosophy. So 3 Hellenic pre-Alexandrian philosophers are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. If we were to talk about Hellenistic, remember I like to think of that word as kind of Greek-ish, Hellenistic philosophies would be Epicureanism and Stoicism. Before I talk about those, however, I just want to point your attention to this famous painting by Raphael. He's a Renaissance painter from centuries, millennia after all of this stuff is going on, and he paints this giant picture. It's a lot bigger than the portion that I have here on the screen, but it's all these different philosophers from all throughout history, and the centerpiece of the painting is Plato on the left and Aristotle, his student, on the right. And you'll see that Plato is pointing up to the sky. He's pointing to what we might call heaven, but the world of ideal forms, the ideal apple. And he has in his hand, this book called Timeo or Timaeus, and it's this treatise that he wrote, this book that he wrote on ideal things, on how we can understand the world around us by thinking about what the ideal version of a thing is. And then Aristotle, rather than pointing up, he has his hand gestured outward to the real world in front of him, and he says, look, we shouldn't be focused so much on ideals and constantly striving toward ideals. That can pull, there's a golden mean in the middle of all of these virtues, not having too little of industriousness and being lazy, but also not striving so hard for that apple, for that single-minded pursuit that you become monomaniacal. So you can think, generally speaking, of Plato's philosophy as, idealism. How can we strive wholeheartedly toward perfection? And then Aristotle's philosophy, which is like, look, what you really should be striving for is contentment or happiness. Maybe you can call this being more realistic, and then Plato's philosophy being more idealistic. And that juxtaposition, that comparison of these two things between being idealistic and being realistic is all over the place. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. And I think it finds it's fleshed out even further in these two philosophies that I'm about to talk about. So first philosophy is Epicureanism, named for this guy Epicurus, and he seemed to be a lot more of a realist and less of an idealist, just to me personally. I'm not saying that this is gospel or anything, but he looked at the world around him and he saw so many unhappy people, and he thought, okay, why are people so unhappy? A lot of times it's because they think that it's because the things that they think will make them happy are not actually going to fulfill them. You think of a guy who drives a beat-up car, and he says, man, if I could just get like a newer car that's just a few years old. And then he gets that car, he drives that for a while, and he goes, oh, if I could get a brand new car, and then if I could get a BMW, if I could get a Maserati. And it's like you're never quite happy. And he says, well, the idea is that you're never going to be happy because of the car that you have. Maybe I should say because of the horse or the mule that you have in the ancient world. Happiness has to stem from things that are actually a lot more accessible than people think. And so he started these communities. We can think of them as communes of people who were living according to Epicurean philosophy and just trying to, I won't say just get by, but largely these are people who are living in small community. They have work that they find meaningful. They're enjoying simple pleasures, and they're not wasting their time pursuing excesses that are not actually going to fulfill them. So Epicurus said there's really just a few things that you need. You need work that is both productive and that you enjoy. So if you can find a job that you enjoy doing it, it's productive, other people benefit from it. You think of someone who works in the trades. If you're a plumber, someone who needs a plumber really needs a plumber. And if you actually can enjoy, all of the puzzle pieces between different pipe fittings and, understanding the irrigation lines under a house and how they feed the system and everything. If you can bring yourself, if you can cause yourself to be the type of person who enjoys that, or carpentry, or being an HVAC tech, there's always going to be people who need their air conditioning and their heat fixed. Another thing is just have a small group of really good friends. You don't need to have 1,000 friends. You don't need to have 20 friends, really. He would say if you have a small group of just 2 or 3 good friends, then that's enough. That's really all that you need. And those relationships are going to be able to benefit you more. You'll be able to pour more of yourself into those people and receive more from them than if you were trying to keep 20 people happy, or God forbid, online trying to keep 1,000 people happy. And then the other thing is just being able to enjoy the simple pleasures. Again, if you're not happy without a Maserati, you're probably not going to be happy for long with a Maserati. If you're not happy without a mansion, then you're probably not going to be happy for long with a mansion. The more money that you have, the more problems you have. And so he would say, look, if thinking of trying to apply this today, you can think of just being able to enjoy a book and a cup of coffee and your dog, on a rainy day, and just being able to enjoy those small things. Let's say that you set aside your Saturday mornings for just some relaxation time, or being able to do something small and simple that you enjoy. It's not trying to hyper stimulate you. It's not trying to goad you on toward accomplish, achieve. No, Epicureans would be a lot more laid back, a lot more relaxed, a lot more what we might call realistic. And then juxtaposed to that, or contrasted with that, with the philosophy of Epicureanism, would be the philosophy of Stoicism. And Stoicism is really a philosophy that I would say comes more into its own during the Roman Empire under people like Seneca and the philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius. But it does have its beginnings in ancient Greek culture, Hellenistic Greek culture. So you have Zeno is one of the earliest Stoic philosophers, and the Stoics were not realists. They were not like, I don't want to try too hard. I don't want to push myself too hard because I might get burnt out. That's a very Epicurean way of thinking, and I'll be honest, it might lead you to be more happy if happiness is what you're after. But the Stoics were not after, let's say, necessarily like happiness in the way that we think about it. They were after striving for, maybe perfection is not the right word, but striving toward living by the absolute order of the universe, right? So understand the universe. They were idealists more so than realists. They believed that you should not be governed by your emotions. Being overly happy or being overly sad or being overly angry, these were indicators that you were not intelligent, that you lacked some kind of perspective. Think about a person who's frustrated when something happens. Well, you usually get frustrated when something happens that you don't like, and it's also unexpected. And if something happened to you that is both unpleasant and unexpected, then it means that you were not smart enough to anticipate that it was going to happen. If I know that something bad is coming for me, in the future, whether it's, I probably ran that light, I saw the camera go off, I'm probably going to get a ticket in the mail, or whether it's, this relationship isn't going well, I feel like I probably need to prepare myself toward ending this relationship. If you can anticipate future problems with better information, and then then when it hits you, you won't be overly sad. You won't be overly angry or frustrated when things happen. And you can think of the ultimate bad thing that's going to happen to you personally is your death. And so the Stoics had, this is where we get the phrase, again, it's going to come from a little bit later on, but memento mori, which just means remember that you are mortal. The Stoics had placed a large emphasis on contemplating your own mortality, contemplating your own death seriously, taking it seriously, actually anticipating it, and considering, okay, how do I want to live so that I'm able to look back on my deathbed? If I get a deathbed, if I get to see it coming in advance, how am I going to be able to look back on my life and say, look, it ended, obviously it ended, I always knew it was going to end. It ended for everybody else. This isn't sneaking up on me. Unless you get hit by a truck, in which case, you don't really get to be happy or sad. So you can think of it that way. But yeah, it's like my life ended. Did I live it in such a way that I can be content with the life that I lived? Have I set up those who are going to come after me to go further, or to be more successful, or to be more, to live more in alignment with the laws of nature? So that was a big philosophical practice of the Stoics, is just daily contemplating their own death, contemplating their own mortality. So the way that a Stoic would live, he's not going to live in a commune with a bunch of his best buddies, and they're just going to hang out and enjoy simple pleasures and, eat some nice food and now and then, and, maybe get a job as a carpenter or something like that. No, Stoics are going to push themselves. They're going to wake up early. They're going to lift heavy. They're going to deprive themselves of all empty pleasures. So you think of the empty pleasure of a delicious meal. It's like, no, a Stoic would say, and this actually was a practice of theirs, and I think it's a useful thing for us to try, is at the beginning of every year, take a week or take a month if you're willing, and sleep on the floor with one blanket and eat only bread and drink only water. If you can do that for a week, then at the end of that week, you'll be able to look back and go, wow, I was able to subsist just on those things. Look at how much more than that I have. I have a bed. I have food that's not just bread, and I have drink that's not just water. But the Stoics would say that you should live, even when we say Stoic today, we're talking about living a life that's very modest, a life that's very, direct. It's directed. A Stoic is not somebody who's going to wear fancy clothes or need to drive a Maserati. They're going to want to give their best, however, in everything that they do. Not for accomplishment to prove yourself to the outside world, but to be able to live a life of peace, understanding that you have lived by a code. You have not gone against your code. You have not lied or swindled or cheated or stolen in order to get where you are, but you lived according to the laws of nature. You lived according to your code. You pushed yourself as hard as you could in accordance with that code, and so you can die fulfilled. And so this contrast of being wanting to live an idealized life versus just wanting to live a happy or a content life, what we might call a realized life, are still in the heart of every individual today. People talk about burnout. They say, well, I don't want to push myself too hard because I just want to be happy. I don't want to take this idea too far because what I'm looking for is not perfection. I'm just looking for contentment. Whereas you have other people, sometimes they get called, type A personalities, who say, look, I'm not going to be happy if I don't do something perfectly. So I'm not striving for, I need to be more realistic. No, I need to be idealistic. I need to push myself with everything that I have to accomplish the ideal. And even when we talk about politics, we talk about people who are idealistic versus realistic. I consider myself, at least in my understanding of history, to be a realist, which means that, well, let me talk about idealism first. Idealism would say, America does the things that it does because of Christian values, or, these Muslim countries, they do things that they do because of Muslim values, and the communist countries, they do the things that they do because of communist values. They're living and conducting themselves according to their ideals. But then if you look at the way that these countries behave, they're not living according to those or any other stated ideals. They're usually just doing what is realistically going to make them more powerful. So realism is this idea that countries, and you can say even individuals, while they might have a set of ideals, they usually wind up making their decisions and especially countries, maybe less so individuals, but especially large groups of individuals and especially countries, they usually wind up making their decisions not based on their faith, not based on their, stated economic or political values, but based on, hey, what's going to make me safe and increase my power and, make me more prosperous. That's, being more, realistic about it. So that's something to keep in mind as we get, later and further into history when we talk about, let's say ancient Rome, which we'll start on in the next lecture, or if we talk about the medieval nation states of France and England, or the Holy Roman Empire, or even talking about the Cold War, the modern world today, you'll notice that countries tend to act not based on stated ideals, but based on, hey, what's going to shore up my power? What's going to increase my power and increase my ability to be safe from other people who are either have or I'm afraid are going to get power. So a long, explanation of that idea here at the end. But again, this is an important thing to understand, is just this contradiction, or let's just say a contrast between Plato's philosophy of the world of forms and striving and perfection, and what eventually, I'll say finds its identity in Stoicism, and then Aristotle's, no, don't go too far in any one direction, just stay in the middle, make yourself happy. That's the more Epicurean philosophy. Talk more about that, those things throughout the entire rest of this series, because this is a spectrum that I think is really important to keep in mind as we talk about history, psychology, philosophy, religion, everything that we're going to talk about going forward. So thank you so much for your time. I know this has been a little bit longer of a one, but I truly do hope you have a blessed day, and I hope to see you next time.